The train pulled into the station at 9:15, its headlight cutting through the dusk like a tired eye opening. I stood on the platform with my single bag slung over my shoulder, watching passengers stream from the cars in front of me. Families with too much luggage, business travelers clutching phones, a few backpackers who looked like they hadn't seen a shower in days. The usual mix of people running towards something or away from it. I was definitely in the latter category. The conductor's whistle echoed off the station's vaulted ceiling, and I climbed aboard car 7, my ticket crumpled in my palm. The narrow corridor smelled like industrial carpet and that particular staleness that clings to public transportation, a mixture of stranger's breath, old coffee, and something vaguely antiseptic. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh, unflattering whites and grays. Seat 14B, window seat. I specifically requested it when booking online 3 days ago, though I couldn't remember why now. Maybe because I thought I'd want to watch the landscape blur past, or maybe because facing away from other passengers seemed easier than the alternative. The compartment was mostly empty when I found my row. A woman in her 60s sat 3 seats ahead, already settled in with a romance novel and a thermos. Across the aisle, a man in a rumpled suit was pulling files from his briefcase with the frantic energy of someone who'd fallen behind on work. The rest of the seats stretched out like an invitation to solitude. I shoved my bag into the overhead compartment and slumped into 14B, immediately tilting my head against the cool window. Outside, the platform was still busy with last-minute arrivals, people saying goodbye, taxi drivers waiting for fares. The glass fogged slightly where my breath hit it, and I found myself drawing absent patterns in the condensation with my finger. My book, some literary novel I'd grabbed from the airport bookstore, sat unopened on my lap. I'd bought it with good intentions, thinking 12 hours on a train would be the perfect opportunity to read something meaningful, to do something productive with all this empty time stretching ahead of me. But now, looking at the cover, I couldn't summon the energy to crack it open. The protagonist's name was probably David or Michael. He probably lived in New York or maybe San Francisco. He probably had complicated feelings about his father. I already had enough complicated feelings of my own. The train lurched gently as more passengers boarded, and I pressed my forehead harder against the window. The metal was surprisingly warm, despite the cool August evening air seeping through the crack where the window didn't quite seal. Someone had tried to close it properly but failed, leaving a thin gap that let in the sounds of the station, distant announcements, the hiss of hydraulic doors, conversations in languages I couldn't identify. "Excuse me?" The voice came from beside me, soft and low. I turned to see a man standing in the aisle, one hand resting on the back of seat 14A. He was tall, probably 6'2" or 6'3", with thin dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. His jeans were the kind of worn denim that spoke of actual work rather than designer distressing, and his gray t-shirt was simple, unremarkable. But there was something about his presence that made the fluorescent-lit train car feel smaller. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, nodding toward 14A. I glanced at the empty seat, then back at his face. He had tired eyes. Not sleepy tired, but the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. Dark brown eyes with flecks of amber that caught the overhead lights. A thin scar ran through his left eyebrow, so faint I almost missed it. "No," I said, "it's all yours." He nodded and lifted a worn leather messenger bag into the overhead compartment. His movements were deliberate, economical, no wasted energy. When he settled into the seat beside me, I caught the faintest scent of soap and something else, maybe coffee or the lingering smell of cigarettes from someone who'd quit but still carried the ghost of the habit. The train shuddered and began to move. I turned back to the window, watching the platform slide past in slow motion. The station fell away, replaced by the industrial outskirts of the city, warehouses and storage facilities, their windows glowing yellow in the gathering darkness. A few homeless camps tucked under overpasses, parking lots full of cars that belonged to people who were home having dinner, watching television, living their ordinary lives. The man beside me didn't try to make conversation. He pulled a paperback from his bag, something with a black cover and minimal typography, and opened it to a page marked with what looked like a coffee shop receipt. The book was clearly well read, its spine cracked in multiple places, pages softened from handling. I found myself glancing at him from the corner of my eye, trying to read the title upside down. Something by Cormac McCarthy, I thought, though I couldn't be sure. It seemed to fit him somehow. The spare prose, the careful attention to landscape and loneliness. The train picked up speed as we left the city behind, and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks settled into a steady pulse. Outside, suburb gave way to farmland, and farmland gave way to forest. The sun had fully set now, leaving only the train's windows reflecting our fluorescent-lit interior back at us. Occasionally, distant house lights flickered between trees like scattered stars. I tried to focus on my own book, finally opening it to the first page. David Martinez had been thinking about his father again. I read the sentence 3 times without absorbing it, too aware of the presence beside me. The man, I realized I didn't even know his name, turned pages at regular intervals. But I noticed he sometimes paused for long stretches, as if considering something carefully. Around 10:30, he reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small packet of mints. The wrapper crinkled softly as he opened it, and the scent of peppermint briefly overwhelmed the train's stale air. He took one, then glanced over at me. "Long ride," he said, offering the packet. His voice was even softer than I'd remembered from our brief exchange earlier. There was something about it, not quite an accent, but a particular way of shaping words that suggested he was from somewhere else originally, the South maybe, or the Midwest. "Thanks," I said, taking a mint. Our fingers brushed briefly as I reached for the packet, and I felt the calluses on his hands. Whatever work he did, it wasn't behind a desk. He nodded and went back to his book, but something in the air between us had shifted. The silence felt different now, less like 2 strangers ignoring each other and more like 2 people choosing not to fill the space with unnecessary words. I let the mint dissolve slowly on my tongue, watching the darkness rush past outside. The train had reached its cruising speed now, swaying gently on the tracks as we climbed into the mountains. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our next stop wouldn't be until after midnight and that passengers were welcome to recline their seats for sleeping. The woman with the romance novel was already dozing, her book splayed open on her chest. The businessman had finally given up on his files and was staring out his own window with the glazed expression of someone replaying the day's failures. The train car had taken on that particular quiet that comes when strangers are forced into proximity for extended periods, a careful, negotiated silence where everyone pretends to be alone while remaining acutely aware of everyone else. I closed my book and leaned back in my seat, letting my eyes drift shut. But sleep felt impossible. My mind kept circling back to the last 3 days, the phone calls and decisions, and the careful dismantling of a life that had never quite fit properly anyway. The apartment I'd left behind, still half packed, waiting for movers who would come tomorrow to finish what I'd started. The job I'd walked away from without 2 weeks' notice. The conversations I'd avoided having. The train swayed around a curve, and I felt my shoulder brush against something solid. I opened my eyes to find that the man beside me had reclined his seat and shifted slightly toward the window. His shoulder was pressed lightly against mine, and he was looking out at the darkness with an expression I couldn't read. He must have felt me watching because he turned slightly, meeting my eyes in the reflection of the window glass. "Sorry," he murmured, starting to move away. "It's fine," I said quickly, and I meant it. The contact was surprisingly comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this metal tube hurtling through the night. He settled back into position, his shoulder still touching mine. Neither of us acknowledged it directly, but neither of us moved away either. Outside, the landscape had become almost abstract, dark shapes of mountains against a slightly lighter sky, broken occasionally by the distant glow of a town nestled in a valley. The train's headlight carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead of us, illuminating pine trees and rock faces that vanished as quickly as they appeared. I found myself thinking about momentum, how once something is set in motion, it becomes easier to keep moving than to stop, how leaving had felt impossible until the moment I was already gone. How this train, loaded with sleeping strangers, was carrying us all toward destinations we'd chosen for reasons we might not fully understand. The man beside me had closed his book and was holding it loosely in his lap. His breathing had deepened, but I could tell he wasn't asleep. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers still moved occasionally against the book's cover, that suggested he was as wakeful as I was. Around 11:30, the train began to climb more steeply into the mountains. The air outside grew thinner and cooler, and the draft from the cracked window became more pronounced. I considered asking him to help me close it properly, but the cool air felt good against my skin. It smelled like pine and snow, even though it was still August. The conductor dimmed the lights at midnight, leaving only the small reading lights above each seat and the pale blue glow from the emergency exit signs. The change in lighting transformed the train car completely. What had been harsh and institutional became intimate, almost cocoon-like. Passengers became shadows and silhouettes. The woman with the romance novel was snoring softly now. The businessman had finally fallen asleep with his head tilted back at what looked like an uncomfortable angle. In the new darkness, I became even more aware of the man beside me, the line of his profile against the window, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the warmth radiating from his shoulder where it touched mine. I turned slightly in my seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, and caught him doing the same thing. For a moment we were facing each other in the dim blue light, close enough that I could see the details of his face that had been hidden in the harsh fluorescent glare earlier. His skin was weathered in a way that suggested time spent outdoors. The scar through his eyebrow was more pronounced in the shadows, and there were fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun or wind. His mouth was wide, with a lower lip that was slightly fuller than the upper. There was something about his face that seemed familiar, though I was certain we'd never met. "You're not sleeping either, huh?" he said, barely above a whisper. I shook my head. No. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with everything we weren't saying. The train swayed around another curve, and I felt his knee brush against mine through the thin airline-style seats. Neither of us pulled away. We sat like that in the darkness, two strangers suspended in time and space, moving through the night toward destinations we'd chosen for reasons we might never fully explain. The train's rhythm had become hypnotic, a steady percussion that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. Outside, the world rushed past in streaks of silver and black, mountains and valleys and forests that existed only in the brief moment they were illuminated by our passing. I found myself studying his hands where they rested on his book. Long fingers, the nails trimmed short and practical. A thin white scar across the knuckles of his right hand. No wedding ring, though there was a pale band of skin on his ring finger that suggested there had been one recently. "Where are you headed?" I asked, the question emerging before I decided to ask it. "Denver," he said. "You, same." He nodded as if this made perfect sense, though the coincidence seemed worth remarking on. Instead, we lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, charged with possibility rather than mere politeness. The train began to descend and my ears popped slightly with a change in altitude. Outside, I could see the lights of a small town scattered across a valley floor like dropped coins. We wouldn't stop there. Our next station wasn't until after 2 in the morning, but the sight of those distant windows made me think of people sleeping in their own beds, dreaming their own dreams, completely unaware of our passage through their night. "I've never done this before," I said, surprising myself again with the admission. "Taken a train?" "Left everything behind." He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much, revealed something that was meant to stay hidden, but when he spoke, his voice was even gentler than before. "It gets easier," he said. "The leaving. Is that what you're doing? Leaving?" He considered this, tilting his head slightly. "Maybe, or maybe I'm arriving. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." I knew exactly what he meant. The past 3 days had felt like both an ending and a beginning, though I couldn't say which was stronger. The relief of walking away from something that wasn't working warred with the terror of not knowing what came next. The train swayed again, more pronounced this time, and I realized I was leaning into the motion rather than bracing against it, letting myself be carried along by forces larger than myself. It was a new feeling, this surrender to momentum, and it was both frightening and oddly liberating. "What's your name?" I asked. "James," he said, "but most people call me Jamie. I'm Alex. Nice to meet you, Alex." The formality of the exchange was absurd given our proximity, the intimacy of traveling through the night together, but it also felt necessary. A small acknowledgement that we were real people with real names, not just shadows passing each other in the dark. "What do you do, Jamie?" I asked, then immediately felt stupid for defaulting to such a conventional question, but he didn't seem to mind. "Construction mostly. You?" I was in marketing, was being the operative phrase. "Burned out?" "Something like that." He nodded as if he understood perfectly, and I had the sense that his own relationship with work was complicated in similar ways. We were probably around the same age. I was 32 and he looked to be maybe a few years older, which meant we'd both entered the workforce during the recession, when any job felt like a gift you couldn't afford to refuse. But somewhere along the way, gratitude had curdled into obligation, and obligation had become a prison you built around yourself, one compromise at a time. "What will you do in Denver?" he asked. "I don't know yet. I have a friend there who said I could stay with her for a while, figure things out." "That's generous." "Yeah, Emma's good people. We went to college together, but she moved out there about 5 years ago. She's been trying to get me to visit ever since." "And now you're doing more than visiting." "Yeah, now I'm doing more than visiting." The train began to climb again, the engine working harder as we ascended another grade. Through the window, I could see we were following a river valley, the water visible as a dark ribbon reflecting occasional patches of starlight. The moon had risen while we were talking, a thin crescent that cast everything in silver and shadow. "Do you mind if I ask what happened?" Jamie said. "That made you leave." I considered the question. 3 days ago, I would have given him the sanitized version: creative differences with management, time for a change, wanting to explore new opportunities. But sitting here in the dark, suspended between one life and another, the truth felt easier than the lie. "I had a panic attack in a client meeting," I said. "Full blown, couldn't breathe, had to leave the room, kind of panic attack. And afterwards, sitting in my car in the parking garage, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy. Not just content or distracted, but actually happy." Jamie was quiet, waiting for me to continue. "So I went home and started looking at train schedules. Don't ask me why trains specifically, but I bought a ticket to Denver and called my boss the next morning to quit. Didn't give notice, didn't even finish my projects, just quit." "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," I said immediately. Then, after a pause, "but also kind of amazing, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale." He smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from him. It transformed his face completely, erasing the tiredness and revealing something warmer underneath. "I know that feeling," he said. "Yeah? I was married until about 6 months ago. Good woman, but we wanted different things. She wanted kids and a house in the suburbs and Sunday dinners with extended family. Normal stuff, good stuff even, but every time she talked about our future, I felt like I was suffocating." He paused, looking out at the darkness rushing past. "The divorce was mutual, which somehow made it worse, like we were both admitting we'd been wrong about something fundamental. I stayed in town for a while, trying to make it work, but everywhere I went, I saw the life we'd been building together. So finally, I packed up my truck and started driving west. And ended up on a train. Truck broke down in Kansas City, figured it was the universe telling me to slow down." I laughed quietly and he looked surprised, then pleased that had made me laugh. "What's funny? Just the idea of the universe having opinions about your transportation choices. Hey, the universe has very strong opinions about everything. You just have to know how to listen." There was something about the way he said it, not quite joking, but not entirely serious either, that made me think he'd spent a lot of time alone with his thoughts recently. Long drives and longer nights working out the mathematics of a life that hadn't added up the way he'd expected. The train rounded a long curve and suddenly the window was full of stars. We'd climbed high enough that The light pollution from the valley below no longer washed out the sky, and the night was dense with constellations I hadn't seen since childhood camping trips. Jesus, I breathed, pressing my face closer to the glass. Jamie leaned over to look out my window, and suddenly he was very close. Close enough that I could feel the warmth from his skin, smell the fading scent of his soap. His shoulder pressed against mine as he tried to get a better angle on the view, and I found myself holding my breath. Amazing, he said softly. I grew up in a small town, but I'd forgotten how many stars there actually are. He didn't move away immediately, and neither did I. We stayed like that, both of us looking out at the night sky, his breath fogging the glass next to mine. The train swayed gently on the tracks, rocking us like children being sung to sleep. There's the Big Dipper, he said, pointing to a cluster of stars above the tree line, and Cassiopeia, I added, indicating the distinctive W shape near the horizon. You know astronomy? A little. My dad was into it when I was a kid. We used to go camping every summer, and he'd wake me up in the middle of the night to look at meteor showers or eclipses. That sounds nice. There was something wistful in his voice that made me glance at him. In the reflected starlight, his profile looked younger, softer. What about your dad? I asked. He wasn't really the camping type, more of a fix-it-yourself and don't complain kind of guy. I nodded, understanding. We all had our version of that father, the one who loved us but didn't know how to show it in any way that felt like love. Jamie finally leaned back in his seat, but he didn't move away entirely. Our shoulders remained touching, a point of contact that felt both casual and deliberate. The stars wheeled past outside as the train continued its journey through the mountains, and I found myself thinking about the strange intimacy of traveling with strangers. How physical proximity could create a kind of temporary emotional intimacy that might take months to develop under normal circumstances. Can I ask you something? Jamie said. Sure. Are you scared about starting over? I considered the question seriously, watching the dark shapes of mountains against the star-filled sky. Yeah, I said finally, but it's different from the fear I was living with before. That was the fear of staying stuck, of never changing, of waking up at 65 and realizing I'd spent my whole life waiting for permission to live it. This fear is, I don't know, cleaner somehow. It's the fear of not knowing what comes next, but at least it's moving in a direction. Jamie nodded slowly. That's a good way to put it. Moving fear versus stuck fear. What about you? Are you scared? Terrified, he said immediately, then laughed quietly, but also more excited than I've been in years. Which is probably crazy. Probably, but the good kind of crazy. Yeah, the good kind. We lapsed back into comfortable silence, but I was more aware than ever of his presence beside me, the way he breathed deep and steady, the occasional shift of his weight in the narrow seat, the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. I found myself wondering about his life before this train. The marriage he'd mentioned, the house they'd probably shared, the conversations over breakfast about weekend plans and retirement savings, the slow accretion of shared routines and compromises that eventually becomes indistinguishable from love until one day you wake up and realize you've been living someone else's dream. Do you miss it? I asked. Being married. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. I miss the idea of it, he said finally. I miss having someone to call when I'm running late or someone to ask about their day. I miss the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. But the actual marriage, no. I don't miss feeling like I was disappointing someone just by being who I am. I knew that feeling intimately, though in my case it wasn't a spouse but a whole life structure. The job, the apartment lease, the social obligations, the careful maintenance of an identity that had never quite fit properly. "What's the longest you've ever been alone?" I asked. "You mean single?" "I mean alone, really alone, without anyone expecting anything from you." He thought about it. "Maybe 2 weeks, when I was between jobs a few years ago. Sarah, my ex-wife, was visiting her sister and I had the house to myself. I barely left except to go to the grocery store, just read books and watched old movies and took long showers without anyone asking what I was doing." How did it feel? Like the first full breath I'd taken in months, which should have been a sign about the marriage, probably. I laughed quietly. I did something similar when I quit my job. Spent 2 days in my apartment with my phone turned off, just sitting on my couch and staring at the wall. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. And then you bought a train ticket. And then I bought a train ticket. The train began to descend again, winding down through a series of switchbacks that made the stars wheel dizzyingly past the windows. I could feel the change in air pressure in my ears, and I realized we must be getting close to our next stop. The first one since we'd left the city over 3 hours ago. "Are you getting off in Glenwood Springs?" Jamie asked, apparently reading my thoughts. "No, straight through to Denver. You?" "Same." I felt a small flutter of relief, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like we'd made any plans beyond this train ride, and I barely knew him beyond his name and the basic contours of his story. But the thought of him getting off at an intermediate stop, of continuing this journey alone, felt suddenly unbearable. The train's brakes began to engage with a low, sustained hiss, and the rhythm of the wheels on tracks slowed from its hypnotic cruising pace to something more deliberate. Outside, I could see the scattered lights of a town growing larger and more defined. A few late-night establishments still glowing, empty streets with the occasional car passing under street lights. "Glenwood Springs," the conductor announced over the intercom. 5-minute stop. "Passengers boarding or disembarking in Glenwood Springs, please have your tickets ready." The train eased into the station with a series of mechanical sighs and clanks. Through the window I could see a few people waiting on the platform. A family with too much luggage, an elderly man with a cane, a young woman who looked like she'd been traveling for days. Jamie shifted in his seat, and for a moment I thought he was preparing to get off, but he was just adjusting his position, settling more deeply into the reclined seat. "Long way still to go," he said quietly. "Yeah." The conductor's whistle echoed through the station and new passengers began boarding. I could hear their voices in the corridor, the shuffle of luggage, the conductor checking tickets. A few people passed by our row, looking for empty seats, but car 7 was still mostly vacant. The train lurched gently as it began to move again, pulling away from the station lights and back into the darkness of the mountain night. The stars reappeared overhead, and the river valley spread out below us like a ribbon of black silk. I realized I'd been holding my breath during the stop, some part of me afraid that the spell of this night would be broken by the intrusion of the outside world. But now, moving again through the darkness with Jamie still beside me, The intimacy of our shared journey reasserted itself. Are you tired? He asked. Not really. Too wired, I think. What about you? Same. Feels like my mind won't stop moving. I knew exactly what he meant. Despite the late hour and the steady rhythm of the train, I felt more awake than I had in weeks. Every nerve was alert, every sense heightened. The cool air from the cracked window, the faint scent of Jamie's skin, the play of light and shadow across his face, everything felt vivid, immediate, electric. Do you think we would have talked if this were a daytime train? I asked. He considered this seriously. Probably not. There's something about night travel that makes people more honest. Like Vegas rules, what happens on the overnight train stays on the overnight train, except hopefully with better outcomes than Vegas. I laughed, and he smiled in response. These moments of levity felt precious, like small gifts we were giving each other. What's the first thing you're going to do in Denver? He asked. Take a shower, then probably sleep for about 12 hours. What about you? I'm not sure yet. I have a hotel room reserved for tomorrow night, but after that, he shrugged. I guess I'll figure it out. Where are you staying? The Crawford, downtown. That's nice. Emma lives in Cap Hill, which isn't far from there. Emma's your college friend? Yeah, she's a photographer now, mostly weddings and corporate stuff, but she does some really beautiful landscape work too. She's been sending me pictures of Colorado for years, trying to convince me to visit. What kind of photography do you like? The question caught me off guard, partly because it had been so long since anyone had asked me about my preferences rather than my obligations. I don't know much about it, technically, I said slowly, but I like images that feel like they're capturing something that's about to disappear, or maybe something that's just beginning, those in-between moments. Jamie nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. There's something about transition that's inherently beautiful, even when it's painful. Is that what this is? A transition? I think so. For both of us. He said it so matter-of-factly, but there was something profound in the simple acknowledgement. We were both in transit, literally and figuratively. Two people who had stepped outside the familiar patterns of our lives and were now hurtling through the darkness towards something unknown. The train began to climb again, the engine working harder as we ascended what the conductor had announced earlier was the highest point of our journey. Outside, the air was thin enough that the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the silence between mountains was so complete it felt like moving through space itself. I keep thinking about my apartment, I said suddenly. The movers are coming tomorrow to pack up the rest of my stuff, and I won't be there. Just strangers handling all my things, deciding what goes in what box. How does that feel? Like watching my life from a distance, like it all belonged to someone else. Jamie was quiet for a moment. I felt that way about the divorce, like I was watching someone else's marriage end, even when I was the one signing the papers. Do you think that's normal, that disconnection? I think it's how we protect ourselves when change is too big to process all at once. The full reality of what we're doing hasn't hit yet. I thought about this, watching the dark shapes of peaks pass by outside. He was probably right. Somewhere between quitting my job and buying this train ticket, I'd entered a kind of suspended state where decisions felt theoretical, consequences postponed. When do you think it will hit? I asked. Tomorrow maybe, or next week? Or 6 months from now when we're both living completely different lives and can barely remember what we were running from? The pronoun caught my attention. We're both living different lives. as if our separate journeys were somehow connected, which they weren't, of course. We were strangers who happened to be traveling in the same direction, sharing a few hours of darkness and conversation. Tomorrow we'd get off this train and disappear into our separate uncertainties. But sitting here beside him, feeling the warmth of his shoulder against mine, it was easy to imagine that our stories were intertwined in ways we couldn't yet understand. The train swayed around another curve, and Jamie shifted slightly in his seat. His hand, which had been resting on his book, moved to the armrest between us. His fingers were less than an inch from mine. I found myself studying those fingers in the dim light, the calluses that spoke of manual work, the thin scar across his knuckles, the way they curved slightly as if he were holding something invisible. There was something about his hands that made me want to touch them, to trace the lines of his palm, to understand the story they told about who he was and where he'd been. The thought surprised me with its intensity. I'd been attracted to men before, had even had a few relationships that lasted longer than a few months. But there was something different about this attraction, something that felt less like desire and more like recognition, as if I were seeing something familiar in a stranger's face. "Alex?" Jamie's voice was soft, questioning. I realized I'd been staring at his hands for too long, and I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not uncomfortable exactly, but aware, alert. "Sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. "Don't be." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning I wasn't ready to examine too closely. We looked at each other in the dim blue light, and I felt something shift, a subtle recalibration of the space between us, like the moment when two people realize they're having a different conversation than they thought they were having. Jamie's fingers moved slightly on the armrest, not quite reaching for mine, but not moving away either. The train swayed again, and this time when our shoulders touched, it felt deliberate rather than accidental. "This is probably crazy," he said quietly. "What is this? Whatever this is." I knew what he meant, but I wasn't ready to name it either. The strange interpalm intimacy that had developed between us over the course of the night, the way conversation had given way to something more physical and immediate. The awareness of his body beside mine, of the warmth radiating from his skin, of the way his breath caught slightly when I looked at him directly. "Maybe," I said, "but it doesn't feel crazy." "No, it doesn't." His hand moved closer to mine on the armrest, and I could feel the heat of his skin without actually touching him. The space between us felt charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. "I should probably mention," he said, his voice even softer now, "that I've never done anything like this before." "Like what?" "Met someone on a train, or—" He paused, searching for words. "I've never been with a man." The admission hung between us, vulnerable and honest. I felt my heart rate increase, not from surprise, but from the trust implicit in his words. "That's okay," I said. "There's no rule book for this." "Are you sure about there being no rule book?" "Pretty sure." He smiled at that, and some of the tension in his shoulders relaxed. "I meant, are you sure it's okay? That I don't know what I'm doing. Nobody knows what they're doing, Jamie. That's not unique to this situation." His laugh was quiet, breathy. "That's comforting, I guess. Besides," I said, finally letting my fingers brush against his on the armrest, "we're not doing anything. We're just sitting on a train, talking." "Right, just talking." But even as he said it, his fingers curled slightly, catching mine in a loose hold that felt like the most natural thing in the world. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and I could feel his pulse in the pad of his thumb where it rested against my wrist. We sat like that as the train continued its journey through the mountains, hands barely touching, not speaking. The darkness outside was complete now, broken only by the occasional distant light or the reflection of stars in a hidden lake. Part 2. Time moved differently on the train. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe hours compressed into minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. The steady rhythm of wheels on tracks had become the background pulse of everything, and the darkness outside made it feel like we were suspended in space rather than moving across the earth. Aaron, he corrected me quietly about an hour ago, explaining that Jamie was what his ex-wife had called him, but his real name was Aaron, had shifted in his seat so that he was facing me more directly. Our knees were almost touching now, and his hand still rested lightly against mine on the armrest between us. I keep thinking about breakfast, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Breakfast? There's this diner in the town where I grew up. Opens at 5 in the morning, and they make these enormous pancakes that hang over the edges of the plate. My dad used to take me there on Saturday mornings when I was maybe 8 or 9, just the two of us. I could picture it, a small town diner with cracked vinyl booths and a grill that had been seasoned by decades of bacon grease. The kind of place where the coffee was strong and the waitresses called everyone honey. That sounds nice, I said. It was one of the few times he and I could just talk without my mom or my sister around. He was different there, more relaxed. He'd ask me about school, about what I wanted to be when I grew up, normal dad stuff. What did you want to be? Aaron smiled, and I could see it even in the dim light. A train conductor. I was obsessed with trains when I was little. Had this whole model set up in my bedroom with tiny towns and bridges. What happened to that dream? Same thing that happens to most childhood dreams, I guess. People tell you it's not practical and eventually you start believing them. I thought about my own childhood ambitions. Astronaut, archaeologist, marine biologist. The usual progression from wonder to compromise that most of us experienced somewhere around adolescence. Do you ever miss it? I asked. That certainty about what you wanted? Every day, he said without hesitation. Remember being 8 years old and knowing exactly what made you happy? When did we all agree to stop trusting that instinct? The question hung between us like smoke. Outside, the train was descending again, winding through what looked like a river canyon. The water reflected starlight in broken fragments, and occasionally I could see the dark shapes of trees silhouetted against the sky. I used to write, I said, surprising myself with the admission. What kind of writing? Short stories mostly, nothing good, but I loved the process. Staying up late with my laptop, getting lost in made-up worlds. I had this fantasy about moving to a cabin somewhere and just writing all day. What stopped you? Student loans, rent, the usual suspects. And then I got the marketing job. And it paid well, and there was always some reason to stay one more year. Save a little more money, get more experience. Be practical, Aaron nodded. I know that story. I was going to be a carpenter, actually build things with my hands instead of just maintaining other people's buildings. But construction paid better, had benefits, seemed more stable. Do you regret it? He considered this, his thumb moving absently across my knuckles. Not regret exactly, but I wonder sometimes who I might have been if I trusted myself more. The intimacy of the conversation felt surreal. Here we were, two strangers sharing confessions in the middle of the night, talking about the dreams we'd abandoned and the compromises we'd made. In daylight, surrounded by other people, this level of honesty would have been impossible. But something about the darkness and the movement and the temporary nature of our connection made it feel safe to reveal these buried parts of ourselves. Do you think it's too late, I asked, to go back to those dreams? I don't know. Maybe not too late, but too different. I'm not the same person who wanted to build cabinets and chairs, and you're not the same person who wanted to write stories. So what do we do with that? Maybe we find new dreams, ones that fit who we are now instead of who we used to be. The train began to climb again, and I felt the familiar pop in my ears as we gained altitude. Through the window I could see we were in high country now, sparse vegetation, rocky outcroppings, the kind of landscape that looked almost lunar in the starlight. Can I ask you something? Aaron said. Sure. Do you ever feel like you only exist in transit? The question caught me off guard, but I understood it immediately. There was something about being in motion, on trains, planes, highways, that felt more real than the static moments of everyday life. Yes, I said, like the only time I'm fully myself is when I'm between places. Exactly. Like I'm most alive when I don't belong anywhere. Is that why you're on this train? To not belong somewhere? He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. Partly, I spent so many years trying to fit into the life I thought I was supposed to want. The marriage, the house, the routine. And I was good at it, you know. I could play the part, but it never felt real. And this does, sitting on a train at 2 in the morning with a stranger, more real than anything has in years. His honesty took my breath away. I looked at him in the blue-tinted darkness, this man I'd known for less than 5 hours, and felt a recognition so deep it was almost painful, like seeing my own reflection in an unexpected mirror. I know what you mean, I said quietly. We fell into silence again, but it felt different now, charged with understanding. I closed my eyes and let myself sink deeper into the train seat, acutely aware of every point where our bodies touched. His hand still covering mine, his shoulder against mine, the warmth of his leg where our knees occasionally bumped with the train swaying. I felt him shift beside me, adjusting his position, and suddenly his shoulder was pressed more firmly against mine. Not accidental this time, deliberate, intentional, a small gesture that felt enormous in the context of everything we hadn't said to each other. I opened my eyes and found him looking at me. His face was very close now, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the way his lower lip was slightly chapped, the shadow of stubble along his jawline. This is probably the strangest night of my life, he said softly. Strange good or strange bad? Strange perfect. The words hit me like a physical sensation, warmth spreading through my chest, making it hard to breathe properly. I wanted to say something equally honest, equally vulnerable, but the words felt too big for the quiet space we'd created. Instead, I let my free hand move to rest on his knee, just a light touch, fingers barely making contact through the worn denim, but I felt him go very still. "Is this okay?" I whispered. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and I felt some of the tension leave his body. We sat like that as the train continued its journey through the mountains, hands touching, shoulders pressed together, existing in a bubble of intimacy that felt both precious and fragile. Tell me about Denver, he said eventually. I've never been there. What do you want to know? What you imagine it will be like. I thought about this, watching the darkness rush past outside. Different. Clean air, maybe. Mountains you can actually see. People who chose to be there instead of people who just ended up there. That sounds nice. What about you? What are you hoping to find there? I don't know yet. A job, probably. Maybe an apartment if I decide to stay. But mostly just space to figure out what comes next. How long has it been since your divorce? Officially 3 months, but really about a year. We went to counseling, tried to work things out, spent a lot of money talking to a very nice woman who helped us understand that we weren't right for each other. That must have been hard. It was, but also kind of a relief, like finally admitting something we'd both known for a long time. I thought about my own relationship history, a series of connections that had felt almost right but never quite right, like trying to force puzzle pieces that were close to fitting but not exact matches. Have you ever been in love? Aaron asked suddenly. The question surprised me, both because of its directness and because I realized I wasn't sure how to answer it. I thought so a few times, but looking back, I think I was in love with the idea of being in love more than I was not in love with the actual people. Yeah, and I know that feeling. What about you? With your ex-wife? I loved her. I still do in a way, but I was never in love with her. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. The difference between loving someone and being in love with them was the difference between appreciating a beautiful painting and feeling like you might die if you couldn't touch it. Do you think you'll ever find it? I asked. The real thing? Aaron was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the train's rhythm. I don't know. But tonight, sitting here with you, I think I understand what I've been missing. The admission hung in the air between us like a live wire. I felt my heart rate increase, felt heat rise in my cheeks, felt the space between us crackling with possibility and terror in equal measure. Aaron, I know, he said quickly. I know we just met. I know this is crazy. I know we're both running from something and probably not ready for anything real, but I had to say it. I looked at him in the dim light, this stranger who felt less like a stranger with every passing hour. His face was open, vulnerable, waiting for me to either reciprocate his honesty or shut it down gently. It's not crazy, I said finally, or if it is, it's the good kind of crazy. He smiled at that and some of the tension left his shoulders. The good kind of crazy. Besides, I added, trying to lighten the moment, what's the worst that could happen? We're stuck on this train for another 4 hours. If this gets awkward, we can't exactly escape. That's either very reassuring or terrifying. Both, probably. We settled back into comfortable silence, but the energy between us had shifted again. The conversation had crossed some invisible line, moved us from strangers sharing a moment to something more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Outside, the landscape was changing again. We were descending from the high peaks into rolling foothills, and occasionally I could see the lights of isolated ranches or small towns scattered across the valleys. The sky was still dark, but there was something different about the quality of the darkness. Less deep, less absolute. Dawn was still hours away, but the night was beginning its slow retreat. What time is it? Aaron asked. I checked my phone. Almost 3. Time moves differently on trains. Yeah, like we're in a pocket dimension or something. Maybe we are. Maybe this whole night is happening outside of normal time. The idea appealed to me that this train car, this conversation, this growing connection between us existed in some liminal space where the usual rules didn't apply, where two people could meet and recognize something in each other that they'd been looking for without knowing it. Aaron shifted in his seat and I realized he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked. "I keep thinking about tomorrow, about getting off this train and going back to being strangers." We don't have to be strangers, don't we? What happens when we're back in the real world, dealing with jobs and apartments and all the practical stuff, when this, he gestured at the space between us, doesn't make sense anymore? I didn't have an answer for that. He was probably right. Whatever this was, it belonged to this night, this train, this suspended moment between one life and another. Trying to transplant it into daylight reality would be like trying to keep a dream alive after waking up. "Maybe that's okay," I said. "Maybe some things are meant to be temporary." "Is it though? Okay." I looked at him, this man I was already starting to care about more than was wise, and felt something crack open in my chest. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'm trying to learn how to be okay with not knowing." Aaron nodded slowly. "That might be the hardest thing about starting over, learning to live with uncertainty, but also maybe the most important thing." We talked quietly for another hour, sharing small details about our lives, our families, the places we'd lived and left behind. Aaron told me about growing up in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about learning to fix engines from his grandfather, about the day he realized he was attracted to men and spent 3 months thinking he was broken. I told him about my mother's expectations, about the panic attacks I'd been having for months before the one at work, about the strange relief I'd felt when I finally admitted to myself that the life I'd built wasn't the life I wanted. The conversation felt like archaeology, carefully excavating the buried parts of ourselves and offering them to each other like gifts. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with recognition, with the rare experience of being truly seen by another person. Around 4:30, the train began another descent, and the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom to announce our approach to Junction City, Colorado. Aaron tensed slightly beside me, and I realized this must be his stop. "That's you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yeah, I'm catching a bus to Denver from there." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I'd known this moment was coming, had known from the beginning that this night would end, but somehow I'd managed to push that knowledge to the back of my mind. "How long until we get there?" Aaron checked his phone. "About 20 minutes?" 20 minutes. Suddenly the night that had felt endless felt far too short. The train was moving through a valley now, and I could see the lights of a small city growing larger ahead of us. Dawn was still an hour away, but the sky had begun to lighten at the edges, stars fading into a deep purple that would soon give way to blue. "I should probably get my stuff together," Aaron said, but he didn't move. "Probably." We sat in the growing tension of approaching separation, both of us aware that the spell of the night was about to be broken. The intimacy we'd built over the past 6 hours felt too fragile to survive the harsh fluorescent lights of a train station. The intrusion of other people, the return to ordinary time. Aaron finally stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment. and I watched him stretch, taking in the long line of his body, the way his t-shirt pulled tight across his shoulders. He was leaving and I was staying, and in 10 minutes he would be just a memory. Alex, he said, sitting back down with his back at his feet. Yeah? I want you to know that tonight, it meant something. Even if we never see each other again, even if tomorrow we both convince ourselves it was just the weird intimacy of travel, it meant something. I felt my throat tighten. It meant something to me too. The train began to slow, brakes engaging with that familiar hiss. Outside I could see the Junction City station approaching, a modest building with a few people waiting on the platform, even at this early hour. Aaron reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a pen, then tore a small piece of paper from his book. He wrote something quickly and handed it to me. My email, he said, in case you ever want to tell someone about your new life in Denver. I looked at the paper, aaron.mitchell87@gmail.com, written in neat, careful handwriting. I don't have anything to write on, I said, feeling stupid and unprepared. It's okay, you'll remember mine if you want to. The train was crawling now, the platform sliding past outside the windows. Other passengers were stirring, gathering their belongings, preparing for the brief stop. Junction City, Colorado, the conductor announced. 5-minute stop. Aaron stood, shouldering his bag. I remained in my seat, looking up at him, memorizing his face in the pre-dawn light filtering through the windows. This has been the best, worst night of my life, he said with a small smile. Best, worst? Best because of you. Worst because it has to end. The train shuddered to a stop and passengers began moving toward the exits. Aaron stepped into the aisle, then turned back to look at me. If you're ever on this route again, he said quietly, I'll probably be in the window seat. I wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the strange magic of what had passed between us. But words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of the moment. So I just nodded, and he smiled, and then he was walking away down the narrow aisle, his back bouncing against his hip with each step. I pressed my face to the window and watched him step off the train onto the platform. He looked back once, finding my window, and raised his hand in a small wave. I waved back, and then the conductor's whistle blew and the train began to move again. I watched until he disappeared from view, a lone figure standing on a platform in a small Colorado town as dawn broke over the mountains. Then I leaned back in my seat, his seat now empty beside me, and closed my eyes. But I wasn't tired anymore. I was wide awake, every nerve alive with the memory of his touch, his voice, the way he looked at me in the blue darkness as if he were seeing something he'd been searching for without knowing it. I unfolded the piece of paper with his email address and read it again. Aaron Mitchell, born in 1987. 37 years old, same as me. A man who'd spent the night on a train talking to a stranger about dreams deferred and lives unlived, who touched my hand like it was something precious. The train gathered speed as it pulled away from Junction City, carrying me toward Denver and whatever came next. But part of me remained on that platform, in that moment of connection and loss, in the space between what was and what might have been. Outside, the sky continued to lighten, purple giving way to pink and gold as the sun crested the mountains ahead. It was going to be a beautiful day. I tucked Aaron's email address into my wallet and settled back to watch the sunrise paint the Colorado landscape in shades of possibility. The train rolled on toward Denver, toward my uncertain future, But I was no longer traveling alone. I carried something with me now. The memory of a night when two strangers had found each other in the darkness and recognized something worth holding on to, even if it was only for a few hours. Even if it was ending, maybe especially because it was ending. The best things I was learning were often the most temporary, and the most temporary things were sometimes the most real.